Hello and welcome to our final panel of the Symposium Digitization and Democracy, organized by the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities, the US National Academy of Sciences, and the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina. My name is Jennifer Sarah Boone, and I'm very happy to be leading our final panel discussion, Digitization and Democracy, Where Do We Go From Here? Yesterday and today, we took a look at where we stand right now, how content moderation can be an opportunity, but of course also brings challenges, and we discussed where the potentials lie to enhance democracy. We talked about validation and accountability, how technology can enhance democracy, but also what aspects of computer science, for example, need to be improved, like up-to-date training data or fair algorithms. We touched on how data could be used more responsibly, or how you even could be compensated for giving your data, and where the balance needs to lie between big companies, governments, academia, and society. We also had some optimistic outlooks and some more pessimistic outlooks, so we will see what happens now. It is the time to ask the question, digitization and democracy, where do we go from here? Again, we have three renowned speakers, all leading experts in their field, and I would like to ask them to switch on the camera now, please. And you, dear audience, are once again invited to join the conversation via the Q&A function. You can find the Q&A tool on the control board in the lower part of your screen, and we are looking forward to a lively discussion with everyone joining this session. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Professor Cynthia Dwork, Gordon McKay Professor of Computer Science at the Harvard Paulson School of Engineering, Radcliffe Alumni Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and affiliated faculty at Harvard Law School. She is also a member of the US National Academy of Sciences. Professor Dwork uses theoretical computer science to place societal problems on a firm mathematical foundation, with numerous contributions to cryptography and co-inventions of cryptographic constructions that will remain secure even against quantum computers. We are very happy to have her here with us today. A very warm welcome. And I would love to head straight in. Digitization and democracy. Where do we head from here?
Thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to participate in this panel. Unfortunately, I've been at another meeting for the last couple of days and missed the benefit, so I hope I don't repeat what other people have said. I'm going to actually steer clear of technical details and talk about responsibility. Leslie Lamport, a pioneer of distributed computing, famously said, "A distributed system is one in which the failure of a computer you didn't even know existed can render your own computer unusable." Lamport has been increasingly concerned with developing tools to help reason about complex systems, viewing the development of these tools as being in a race with the complexity of the systems they must govern. My view is that at the moment we're losing this race. But missing from Lamport's analysis is the question of responsibility. Is the use of complex systems simply a law of nature, or can it be governed? Can we ensure that we have enough lifeboats on this Titanic, or is this a lost cause? And whose job is this? In some contexts, fail-safe critical systems for controlling a nuclear reactor, for example, ensuring robustness through distributed control is essential. But even here, it's someone's responsibility to manage the system. The social media platforms have to a large extent subverted the notion of a locus of responsibility. The news is a case in point. Curation and investigation are essential, but they're being subverted both by undermining the news business financially and in hiding the curation process. Is it in fact democratized, or is it heavily tilted by political forces? Or is it simply being made more shocking and more extreme to maximize engagement? How can these processes be audited? Social media also externalize human costs. The platforms exist because the engagement technology scales, but the ability to mediate content judiciously and effectively, the supply of lifeboats, if you will, has not scaled. And this is another abdication of responsibility. We need to redefine the very concept of scaling to insist on responsible scaling. The engagement technology scales, but the public health mitigation, getting people out of their chairs and out into society, has not. How can we introduce accountability and responsibility? These are not strictly technical questions. These are socio-technical questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing how the others perceive the lifeboats, if they are on the way or if we are sinking, hopefully not. Next in our panel discussion, I may welcome Professor Michael Birnhack, who is Associate Dean for Research and Professor of Law at the Faculty of Law, Tel Aviv University. Additionally, he is the Director of the S. Horowitz Institute for IP, Information technology, law, especially privacy and copyright issues, are in the center of his focus, and Professor Birnhack has co-founded Privacy Israel and won the 2020 Zeltner Prize for Excellence in Legal Research. It is fantastic to have you here as well, and I would love to hear your perspective on the lifeboats and, of course, the question, digitization and democracy. Where do we go from here?
So thank you, Jennifer, for the kind introduction. And here's some points, more in telegraphic kind of bullet points for the discussion, based to some extent on the discussion in this conference over the last 2 days, but also some new ideas. So first, law and technology will continue to be in an ongoing dialectic relationship. They will continue to affect each other, sometimes join hands and sometimes conflict. And we have to manage with this, and we will never reach peace and tranquility there. And we will always be on this tension between law and technology. A few points here for us to notice in the near future regarding digitalization and democracy. First, I'm extremely troubled with the ongoing and increasing cooperation between the government and the technological giants. So I suggest that we should be aware and instrumentally suspicious of such private-public enforcement moves. So 20 years ago, Niva Elkin-Koren, who spoke yesterday, and myself, we co-authored a paper about the invisible handshake. That was a post 9/11 paper, and we pointed to the ways in which government and the big technological companies of that day, at least, join hands and bypass constitutional guarantees. We see that today in Israel and presumably in other places where the government and Facebook, for example, join hands in content moderation. Over here, the government just asks Facebook, can you please remove this or that because of whatever? And Facebook typically agrees to do so. I would argue that both law and technology should be modest and humble in their aspiration and yet. So on the legal side, I would ask that we should acknowledge the shortcomings of the law, the fact that the law cannot do everything, that it's not always the best solution. And I'm a lawyer, okay, I teach law. And at the same time, we should not give up. The law is, like technology, is a social construct, and it is meant to advance important social needs. And when it's important to us, we should insist on that. For example, what Professor Dwork has mentioned, responsibility and accountability. On the technological side, also, we should not be imperialistic. We should realize that technology has its limits and shortcomings, that it's not neutral and not void of politics, and that it's not the only social power in our environment and ecosystem. We should not forget social concerns. For example, we should never allow anyone to be left behind. We should be keenly aware and fix digital divides and enable equal opportunity to those who wish to engage and participate in democratic processes. From democracy on a more kind of general level, well, yes, there are new theories of democracy and how it can operate best, but as Winston Churchill has famously said, democracy is the worst form of government except for everything else that we've already tried. So let's figure out what are the underlying principles in democracy that are really important to us. Separation of powers is important. Equality is important. Respect to fundamental human rights, such as privacy, freedom of expression, autonomy, respect to human dignity. We should try and maintain these even in front of new technological challenges. I'm very suspicious of companies such as Facebook, which say, well, this is what we are doing, equivalent to the executive branch. We also have some rules of the road for the road, and they annoyingly call that community standards. Now, when Mr. Zuckerberg and his team decide what the rules are, it's no community. It's a top-down community. It's not an organic community in any sense. And of course, now Facebook also has the judicial branch, or sort of, in the form of the review board, about which we have heard here yesterday. Another point, and with that I will end for the time being, globalization. Technology is global, and information crosses borders and all of that. You know, any article about the internet in the 90s and early 2000s has started with some sort of kind of general statements about that. But social norms tend to be local and differ from one place to another. Israel, Germany, the United States, and of course many other countries around the world, each has their own social norms. Some of them are similar, some of them are not so similar. Each system has its own legal rules and principles and system that reflects and enhances and reassures and reinforces these social norms. We should allow some room for that. Yes, we might be missing the global promise of the internet, you know, that like John Lennon said, the world should be as one and all of that. It's beautiful and we have much of that, but we should find the balance between the global promise and the local needs. Otherwise, if we move too fast, we will fall. And when we fall, it may hurt. So we should find the balance, and that is globalization, the meeting of the global and the local. And it's not easy. Of course, it's never easy, and it always meets with resistance from outside or from inside. But I think it's a goal that we should position for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be missing too much, and we should try and have both worlds to the extent possible. Thank you for the time being.
Thank you, Professor Birnhack. Well, I'm looking forward to diving deeper into those topics and maybe getting some solutions of how we can reach globalization. For now, to complete our panelists, a very warm welcome to Professor Johannes Buchmann, computer scientist, mathematician, and physicist, recently retired as a professor of computer science and mathematics at the Technische Universität Darmstadt. We are very happy that he is willing to share his knowledge with us today. His research area is a very talked about subject, cybersecurity and privacy. Holding prestigious awards, he's also a member of the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina, and the chair of Leopoldina's working group on digitization and democracy, which recently published a policy advice paper on this topic. Thank you very much for joining our panel. And of course, we all want to know from you as well, digitization and democracy, where do we go from here?
Yeah, so thank you very much for your kind introduction and for the opportunity to speak here. So what I would like to do is propose a few small lifeboats. Our statement, the Leopoldina statement that was published in the previous week and that was mentioned several times, has 8 recommendations for action, and I'd like to share with you 3 of them, the 3 little lifeboat proposals, which I would like to discuss with you if you want. So the first recommendation concerns the obligation of platforms to establish democratically legitimized oversight boards. Okay, so let me explain this a little bit. So we know that the platforms like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and so forth are powerful infrastructures of the democratic public. That's a fact. However, their goal is not to promote democracy, but mainly to draw our attention to advertising. This is why emotional content and sensations are often prioritized, and that distort the democratic discourse. Also, these platforms allow non-democratic content to be disseminated, for example, hate speech and calls for violence. We have seen this. And therefore, they have recently started censoring content, but I find with democratic legitimization. Also, we also talked several times about the collaboration of these platforms and the governments for surveillance reasons. For all these reasons, it is required to democratically regulate platform content moderation. And the existing Facebook Oversight Board, some consider it as a step in the right direction. However, it is clearly not democratically legitimized. So therefore, we propose that all platforms should be required by law to establish and operate pluralistic boards that let the public participate in designing the content selection strategies of the platform in order to promote democracy. So there should be a corresponding law that should specify the rights and obligations of these boards. And in this way, the boards would be democratically legitimate. This is the first recommendation. The second recommendation concerns the development of AI-based tools that can support us in the extraction and assessment of digital information and communication. So why do we need such tools? Well, I personally find we cannot do without digitization in the city, because often the complexity of digital information and communication is beyond our human cognitive capacities. So in principle, artificial intelligence has the potential to support us here. And therefore, we recommend a major research effort to be undertaken with the goal of developing such platform-independent, fair, and explainable tools. Being explainable means that decision-making criteria can be understood by humans. Fairness refers to the consistency, and Michael was mentioning this, with fundamental democratic values and rights, for example, principles of equal treatment and protection against discrimination. So that's the second recommendation. And the third recommendation concerns obligation of platforms to allow access to their data for research purposes. Why? Progress of digital democracy depends on research. This applies, for example, when we want to develop content moderation strategies, these AI-based tools, and so forth. So such research is almost impossible with access from data. We therefore recommend that platforms should be legally required to make relevant data available for non-commercial research purposes. Of course, this has to be in such a way that their legitimate confidentiality interests are not violated. So I will be very interested in the discussion of these three measures with you: mandatory platform oversight, mandatory access to platform data for research purposes, and artificial intelligence-based content exploration support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Buchmann, and dear audience, you heard it. We are very much looking forward to your thoughts. And I would like to know from you, Professor Buchmann, those are extremely good recommendations. How can we make sure that they don't just remain recommendations? What needs to happen that it is actually implemented?
So first of all, we need a legal process, and what we are looking at in this recommendation, because this is the area in which we live and work, is Europe. We have seen the general data protection law in Europe, and people really take this seriously, and this shows that the process is possible, and we now see slowly an implementation. And it'd be very interesting if we could even go beyond this, and if the colleagues are interested in this kind of thing, also to promote such ideas in other countries and discuss about, I mean, they have different legal systems, obviously, but on the other side, this is really a global thing. And if we could agree on these things, if we could sort of continue the discussion, then I think we have a chance to really make this happen.
Thank you very much. Professor Birnhack, you were nodding. Would you say that that is something where you don't focus so much on the local, but more on the global?
So I think the GDPR is an amazing example, but perhaps it's one of its kind. The GDPR, the European General Data Protection Regulation, has had an amazing, tremendous global impact. And it has done so not in a, well, you know, some may disagree, but I think it was not aggressively applied to other countries. It's not like the World Trade Organization, the WTO, where countries who wish to join have to sign and agree to all of its agreements, even those that less fit their needs, such as TRIPS about IP and other things. The GDPR has a global effect because of what other scholars have called the Brussels effect, right? It's quite a strict kind of regulation. It sets a really high level of privacy data protection regulation, and it has many incentives for companies and governments, but let's focus on companies, to follow up. If a company, I'm thinking of a small Israeli startup being formed as we speak, and you know the guys there are excited, and they think not about the Israeli market. The Israeli market is tiny, okay? They think global. They think about the US. They think about Europe. They think about many other countries in the world where their technology may be exported and sold and used in the future. And they will not bother looking at the outdated Israeli Privacy Act. They will look at the GDPR, and they will follow suit with the GDPR, and they will have one system. For them to tailor their technology to fit different countries is difficult, cumbersome, expensive, and it will make it more difficult for them. It's easier for them to have one kind of technology that fits all. And for that reason, they will choose the GDPR for the time being as their guideline. And we see that. I've been speaking to Israeli DPOs and technology companies, and we chat and we discuss and ask them, what sort of privacy laws do you follow? And immediately they say the GDPR. You know, they may add the CCPA, which is California's Privacy Act, and the Brazilian Data Protection Act, but GDPR. And it's not because the Israeli government has required Israeli companies to follow the GDPR. It's a market, global sort of influence. Now, I'm happy with that because I really like the GDPR. I don't know what I would have thought had I not liked the GDPR. So that's a challenge for me, but for others, when a standard becomes, when a legal standard becomes sort of global, how do we affect it? How do we, how do we evaluate it?
Thank you very much. Professor Dwork, what is your perspective? Do you feel like those are lifeboats and that there is hope? Or where do you see the biggest challenges?
So first of all, I think those were wonderful. And I don't think that they're the end of the story, but I think they're a fantastic starting point. I should comment that on the third one, allowing access for non-commercial research. I think that's a wonderful point. It's a really important point. And I'm not the lawyer here, but I believe that when California passed its smart meter regulations, a carve out was made for using the data for research purposes. There was then a very big fight as to whether formal privacy protection should be applied to those data before being used for research purposes. And the privacy protection people did not win this fight. The economists came in and they said, we need to see raw data, blah, 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 blah. So that's something to bracket for further discussion, is how to protect the privacy and whether to insist on privacy protections or to say, okay, there's a greater good here. We know that once we put in these protections, there are limits on what we can do, so should we? I want to actually focus on your second recommendation about the AI-based tools for extraction and explanation. And this is where you mention fairness. I have done a lot of work in cryptography. I have done a lot of work in privacy preserving data analysis. I have also tried to work in algorithmic fairness. And while I believe that we have made progress formulating questions and starting to answer them, this is by far the hardest area that I've ever worked in. Not because the mathematics are hard, but because formulating the question, formulating the requirement, what is fairness, is phenomenally difficult. These are things that people don't agree on, even in ordinary public discourse. So finding mathematical versions of them that can then be implemented by algorithms is a problem of surpassing difficulty. So, and while we're at it, I should comment on the concept of what does it mean? What does explanation mean? You talked about decision criteria that are understandable by humans. I'm not sure. Do you mean decision criteria for making individual atomic decisions? Do you mean criteria for designing the algorithm in the first place? Are you talking about humans who have task-specific or domain-specific knowledge and expertise, or are you talking about, just the average person? So I'm curious about what you have in mind there. But I think this is a really wonderful beginning for discussion.
Yeah, Professor Buchmann, would you like to chime in directly?
So thank you very much for these positive words. I'm very happy that you consider them as small lifeboats. As far as explainability goes, this I think in our recommendation, this is more an intuitive notion. We know from, and it's the same thing as fairness. I think we have to make this precise, and this is, again, probably not an easy task, because on the one side, there's people to whom this has to be explained, and they have limited understanding capabilities, obviously, and on the other side, there is complex algorithms and complex data from where this comes. But I think it should be done in such a way that if, for example, the decision is based on a bias, it should be possible to detect this. There are these very naive examples, of course, that artificial intelligence programs recognize dogs because it says dog. That is very simple, right? And it's kind of trivial. But I think the direction is that we can see this has a lot to do with fairness. I think somehow explainability and fairness are two things that are related.
Can I raise a question now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So one thing that could be useful both for explainability and for fairness is, or one that could increase is some kind of degree of access to the algorithm that makes the decisions. So if you have an auditing or a fairness sort of committee, it's very important, it's provably mathematically important that they be able to ask for what the algorithm would do on various kinds of instances. So one way of making this possible is just to allow the code to be accessed directly or inspected. And another way is at least to allow Oracle access. I strongly urge you to at least insist on Oracle access in your lifeboat, that it's provably more powerful than not having it.
When we talk about these oversight boards, I didn't mention this, but they should get access to this algorithmic information. This is what we explicitly state in our recommendation. I didn't mention it here.
Thank you. At this point, I would like to invite our audience once again to use the Q&A tool that you can find below the board to also join our conversation. And before we dive deeper into the question about the value of data versus privacy, Professor Birnhack, I have a question for you. You touched on the tech giants. Do you expect an increase or a decrease in the power of the tech giants, and what will the consequences be for democracy?
Right. Well, so, the tech giants definitely have the incentives to become even bigger than they are, because that's what they do, right? Like any organization, they want to continue being relevant and grow. So they have the incentive. They have the mechanism, which is surveillance capitalism, as Shoshana Zuboff has eloquently called it and explained it. And what do we have? As users, it's very difficult because of the network effect. If I'm using a social network because I want to socialize with my friends, we will all end up at the same place, because otherwise we have nobody to talk to if I switch to a new social media, etc. So on our side, there's the network effect and lock-in. It's very difficult to shift to another social media or another platform. And here is where the government should, I believe, should enter. And we've seen that in Europe to some extent, and I think we are beginning to see that now in the United States with the new appointments to the FTC, antitrust law, competition law. If Facebook is not allowed or no longer allowed to hold WhatsApp and Instagram, for example, and will be required to split their holdings, so it's a beginning. And the more separation and competition we have there, I think it will be better for all of us. I'm not very optimistic about this process, because we've seen in the past that antitrust law, even if and when it reaches the right conclusion, it takes so long. It takes ages. But maybe we will be surprised and see faster sort of solutions here to mitigate the power of the technology giants. Now, touching back on the globalization point that I've mentioned earlier, for most of us, these companies are foreign companies. Okay, they are not Israeli, they're not German, they are American companies based in the US. And when they apply US law and US principles, it may be great for Americans. It may be okay with us in some cases, but not always. Just to give you an example from something that has happened here over the last few weeks, and also nicely, I hope, connects to the discussion yesterday. A bunch of extreme right-wing activists in Israel have realized that they were all blocked and thrown out of Facebook and WhatsApp in one day. I'm no fan of those activists, but you know, they have not been warned. They have no idea why they were thrown out. They may have good idea, but they do not know. They were not informed. They have no option to appeal. Okay, and when they ask, okay, let's call Facebook Israel. Well, there is, and you know, I can see it from my window. They have very nice offices here, Facebook, but that's for their R&D and for the sales of advertisements. The management of Facebook Israel is done in Dublin or in the US because they have shifted it following the GDPR and the Schrems 2 case, etc. So there's nobody to talk to. And that is sort of a Kafkaesque situation and not something that would be acceptable had it been the state that silences someone. So the global challenge is enhanced in this case. Explainability, to tie into Professor Buchmann's point, although you have mentioned it regarding algorithms, etc., I think explainability of, you know, the basic, the kind of the top layer of what's going on in the technology, the human decisions based on the usage of technology, that should also be explained. And even that, sometimes it's very difficult to have explanations from the foreign for-profit corporations.
May I add one thing? Just one remark. So that is, so regulation is the one thing. And on the other side, as far as I understand it, when the big tech companies started, they got a lot of financial support. So how about also supporting these alternative initiatives? We have a very strong open data and an even stronger open source community. We know this in computer science. I mean, this is amazing. If you look into the open source community, what they do together and how they support each other is really amazing. You see that something is possible. And this is also one of our recommendations. How about supporting alternative platforms systematically so that they can, for some time, develop?
Thank you very much. We have a question from the audience to Professor Dwork. Politicians in democracies are accountable to their voters. Do we need also algorithmic accountability?
I think this is exactly back to the question of having a locus of responsibility. So I don't know what the questioner means by algorithmic accountability, but there must be somebody who is accountable for the behavior of the algorithm.
And do you feel that there is already someone who is accountable for the algorithm, or is that something that needs to be have more focus on?
I think there needs to be much more focus on this. I think that responsibility is much too dispersed.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have another question from the audience to Professor Birnhack. How is operation of the invisible hand of government on the standard media such as New York Times and CNN different from its operation on Facebook, Apple, and Google?
Okay, thank you. Well, the invisible handshake was mostly about data in its original form, and now it's about content moderation. So here's the structure of the invisible handshake. It's a handshake between the government and the private entities, and it's invisible most of the time. In the United States, at least, private companies such as Google and others may collect personal data with very few limitations. There was no directive on data protection. There is no GDPR. Now we begin to see state laws, but there is no federal law that prevented that. They could and they did collect lots of personal data. If and when the government is interested in such data, for example, in an investigation, law enforcement activities, anti-terror activities, etc., the government typically has to follow Fourth Amendment jurisprudence. They have to obtain a court order for search and seizure of whatever they're looking for. What happens in the invisible handshake mode, which is part of the law? It's in Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act, which was enacted 6 weeks after 9/11. What happens under that scheme is that, Jim or John from the NSA calls his buddy by now, whatever name you can pick up at Facebook or Google, etc., and say, hey, we need your help. Can you please hand over this and that data, because it's really important for preventing a terror attack or an important law enforcement issue, etc. And if Facebook or Google or any other company agrees and assists, they are immune from any liability whatsoever. Okay, that is the mechanism. Now, the government may approach the New York Times or any other media outlet and ask for information. And the nice thing is that the New York Times may say, we don't want to assist you. Now, they may decide otherwise, but if they say, thank you, no thank you, they are protected by the First Amendment. Now, if they do hand over information, they may run into ethical issues. They may run into because the public expects them not to do such things. They may run into, privacy issues to the extent that it applies, depending on the kind of information. Now, when the government, the US government, if they would approach the New York Times and say, hey, can you please delete this item from your website? It's quite likely that the New York Times will say, no way. We have the First Amendment and we have the Pentagon paper case and lots of other case law, and we are not going to do that. And we appreciate your concern, but we are not going to do that. In Israel, what the cyber unit at the Ministry of Justice has been doing is approach Facebook, etc., and ask. All they can do is ask, because these are foreign companies, and they ask them to remove content, and they typically try to frame it as if it were, and maybe they are correct about it, a breach of the community standards. But when I report content which I think is problematic online, on Facebook, etc., Facebook will pay some attention. When the government asks, Facebook really pays attention, and immediately, to those requests. By the way, the Supreme Court over here has authorized this practice and said that the cyber unit does have the official power to approach Facebook, etc., in asking. There's no obligation on Facebook to respond, of course. So I believe these are some of the differences between the old media or offline cooperation that may exist and the online invisible handshake mode that we have identified in the past and now has new incarnations, so to speak.
One question that I have is the line between freedom of speech and hate speech and manipulation is such a fine line. How can one balance it? So how can you make sure that you are protecting people from hate speech, from being manipulated, but still ensure that you do have freedom of speech to a certain extent?
Sure, I will be brief, and I would love to hear my colleagues here on this point as well, if they wish. This, I think, is where the local social norms and laws come into place. Germany has its history, Israel has its history, and the US has its history. And these histories are reflected in laws against or not hate speech. Germany has such laws. Israel, very limited, and the US has the First Amendment saying we don't have and we shall not have such laws against hate speech. So each country has reached a different balance in this tension, and accordingly different results. When I teach, I ask my students, and I have international classes, I ask my students, please, each of you log online to your local Google. Okay, so it's Google DE or Google IL or Google.com, etc. And let's search for some controversial terms. For example, let's search for Jew. And in Germany and in Israel, you will get one set of results. And in the US, typically the top results will be anti-Semitic websites, which we in Israel and in Germany will not see. Okay, because Google applies local norms to its different Google domains. This is what we have.
Very interesting point. Thank you very much. I would love to know your perspective as well, Professor Dwork, Professor Buchmann.
So you're asking me for a perspective on law, which again is not really my expertise, but I don't really think that the First Amendment is what necessarily needs to be guiding Facebook's decisions about what it posts. Facebook is not the government. It should stop pretending to be the government. And it has the option of exercising discretion, and it has the option of minimizing hate speech, and it has the option of minimizing harassment of people. And hiding behind the First Amendment seems to me very strange.
So you feel that it is a positive aspect that they remove content?
I do. I believe in content moderation. I believe in having a site that has standards.
Thank you very much. Professor Buchmann?
So we also discussed this in our working group. And number one, as Professor Birnhack was already saying, there are rules. That's not the issue. And there is also procedures how to sort of implement the rules. There is one important problem. We do not have enough knowledge and personnel among judges, among police people, to really follow up on the many hate speech events that happen and that are clearly against the law. So the issue is not so much, is this against the law, yes or no? There is intermediate cases, but there is many very clear cases. And what we have to do, and this is another recommendation which we have to strengthen the police. We have to strengthen our system in such a way that the laws can really be enforced. That is a very important point.
If I may, you're basically saying you have to add lifeboats.
Say this again, please.
You're saying that you have to add lifeboats, that the scale of the technology is out of step with the scaling of the protective.
Exactly. That is a big issue. I mean, they're doing things. I talk to ministers and so forth. But I mean, this is an issue of simply the number of people who are doing this, and of course, it is about the expertise that the people have that have already work already there. So this is a number of small lifeboats or a big lifeboat or whatever you want to call it, but it's a very important point to make them capable of dealing with these issues. It's a scaling problem.
Thank you very much. Professor Buchmann, we have a question from the audience for you. Will democracy become more resilient thanks to going digital? What is your opinion?
So number one, what I think is that digitization can contribute to resilience. Yes. Will it contribute to resilience? That also depends on the number of lifeboats we put into the sea. Yeah, but what I really think is we cannot do without digitization. I mean, and we cannot do without digital. I mean, the complexity is so big, so that it's like in the old days when they invented book printing and so forth. This was kind of a dangerous thing. I mean, because of book printing, there was this 30-year war somehow, right? So it had very bad consequences in the beginning. But now we all want books, clearly, yeah. And in the same thing, I think digitization is a very important technology, and we have to make very good use of it to make democracy more resilient.
Do you feel that maybe we need to just catch up? That digitization, especially, it was sped up in the last 1.5 years, but it seems like the technology moved faster than the rules, the regulations, the lifeboats. Do you feel that we have some catching up to do, and do you think we will be able to?
We have some catching up to do. And number two, I think we are not, I mean, there is many historical periods where people had to catch up. I think this is not not in this respect, I don't think it's really unique. So yes, we have to catch up. Yes, there are serious problems, but mankind has done this before.
I have another question. I wanted to go back to the open source question and the data question, because on the one hand, the more data you have, the more research you can do, and the better it will also be for everyone, basically, in society. But the question is also how can you balance the act between privacy and progress? So do you need incentives for people to give out the data, for companies to give out the data? Because of course, if you share data like in open research, everyone will profit and benefit at the end.
So I'm happy to jump in on this. I've looked into big medical data a couple of years ago, and I think the potential is huge. And I think key is trust. If we were approached individually and asked, are you willing to share your information, your medical information, for a really important research, COVID-19 vaccination or something, you know, like that, cancer studies, etc. I'm pretty sure many of us, if assured that the data will be used for that purpose and for that purpose only, and it will not have any consequences for us, I'm pretty sure most of us would happily agree. Because of the sense of solidarity and giving something to society, not in order to receive, you know, financial gains, but just be part of, do the right thing. But for that, we really have to trust those who ask for the data, whether it's the government or research entities or universities or private entities. And that's their challenge, to make sure that we trust them. Laws such as the GDPR is one way, but you know, trust is something that takes a long time to build and is very easy to destroy. And it's on their side to make sure that they keep the promises they make. And transparency, accountability, responsibility, legal liability when they fail, all of these are important tools, lifeboats, to assure and guarantee such trust.
Thank you very much. I would like to know from all of you, how do you imagine democracy in 25 years from now, in 50 years from now? Professor Dwork, would you like to start?
No, I wouldn't like to start. I'm terribly pessimistic.
Okay. So you feel that the lifeboats won't be there in time and democracy is sinking, a sinking ship?
I'm very, very worried. I'm very worried. I'm worried by the political forces in my own country. And I don't know the role of digitization in it. I don't know if we can blame digitization for it, but I'm very, very worried. And the next 4 or 5 years are going to be crucial.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Buchmann, positive, optimistic, pessimistic?
No. What I think is, I mean, this is very hard to say. I mean, what we should do is use the energy, instead of answering this question, to really do something for democracy now.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Professor Birnhack.
So I'm also very much concerned about politics in many countries. When we see atrocities in some countries and treatment of minorities and populist regimes in certain places, including in my own country, I'm very much concerned about that. But I refuse to succumb to pessimism. Optimism, as the chair of the Labour Party over here says, optimism is a political position. And that's the position I want to take. I want to be optimistic because otherwise, you know, each of us will cave in their own place and do nothing. So in order for us to make sure that there are lifeboats and make sure that they are prepared and add new lifeboats when we need them, etc., we need to believe that we can change and redirect democracy to make all our lives wherever we are better. I hope that's not too kind of beauty contest statements, but I think that's where we should kind of strive at least and aim our energies.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Birnhack. Thank you, Professor Dwork, Professor Buchmann. We definitely started a very important conversation, and it will be continued beyond today. It needs to be continued beyond today. The things that I've heard yesterday and today the most, and that seem to be the most crucial, is trust, accountability, transparency, and liability. And hopefully we will all be building the lifeboats together quick enough so that we can look into an optimistic and a positive future. Thank you very much to all panelists today, of course, but also earlier today and yesterday. Thank you to all of the speakers of the symposium, and of course also thank you to the audience. On behalf of the 3 organizing academies, the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities, the US National Academy of Sciences, and the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina. Thank you so much once more, Professor Cynthia Dwork, Professor Johannes Buchmann, Professor Michael Birnhack. I'm looking forward to the further discussions in the future where digitization and technology will be used for the better and to enhance democracy, hopefully. And until then, thank you very much. Take care and bye-bye.